Good day, gentle readers. It's time for Logos 2000, 21st Century Foundations. Today what I thought to do was describe one of two concepts, and so probably both then. And so one was about the Knackbaut. A German word, the Knackbaut, is from Heidegger, and it means kind of turning things over and turning things over again. And so, like with something from the end runaround bit a few months ago, it was kind of mentioned the turnarounds of things, and whether that's a regression or whether that's an expansion. So the general idea of the Knackbaut is that it's a sort of necessary act in the reasoning for this sufficient and thorough reason to always have it be so that the necessity of turning something over and looking at it from both sides again is always going to be contingent, because for an arbitrary matter of fact, it's so that nothing's ever so sure that it can be just resistant being considered again. And if it is, then it's of the tentative sort or the fleeting sort or the desperate sort. And as with regards to why we can never go back in time and change things, there's no closed time like curves, and time travel is everybody's constant state of forward progression of time. If that in various technical means time can slow with regards to various observers, as it may so be in space contraction, that as well as yet the clock's always either slow or meet. And so that's in this manner. The notion of an idea as always being inspectable in this kind of a way has that one of the ideas I thought to talk about today was about the Knackbaut, and that somebody has the knack for something, or that they can pick it up and turn it around, and these kinds of things is just one of these concepts making for the principle of sufficient and thorough reason. And then is whether if it's a regress or like an ideation of a sort that's positive or that it's negative, when always constantly turning something over with regards to its significance or lack thereof sometimes, and trying to figure out how to make it so that reason isn't interminable, yet it is well not terminated. Has that it's kind of just considered better that it's not terminated, the reasoning. And so in this manner it's accepting that while it's possible to pick up and put down theories, that as well there's at least one that will constantly survive this meddling of otherwise reconsideration and these kinds of things. And this is largely for matters of this sort of abstruse yet profound fact. It not necessarily so much for something that in a given contingent operation, there's no regrets, sometimes people say, or you can't go back again, this kind of thing. With regards to time, vis-a-vis introspection and reflection and the contemplation and deliberation and the chance of making decisions or changes, as it may be, that it is well a considerable enough thing to have it so that when given the strength of reason, the strength of reason can't merely be that it was this silver line, as it were, of a forward induction, but it has to be this sort of permanent and enduring silver line that's resistant to meddling. So one of the concepts I just wanted to mention was about the Knackbaut, and so in consideration of that, if I mention Heidegger, then I'd also want to mention Steiner. And so that Steiner, as a reader of Heidegger, would also make sure that his study of the language and the considerations of the entbergung, that thing which shows itself yet hides itself, as an example of the Fraudverdict and Froglich and Frogverdict, the questionable and the dubitable, help to effect to reflect that the suffer none by being answered again. And in fact, that they are answered in the same way helps very much show the strengths and the reliability of this sort of logic. Well, in the sense of science, for example, with all the data. And so that also makes it so that for a sufficient and thorough account, that it's not just all the data then, but then all the data and as it arrives as well. So it kind of reflects on consciousness, that's what consciousness is just a cycling, say. You can look at that neuroanatomically if you care to, although no one's really quite sure how to do that without getting inside the brain mechanically or physically or otherwise via things. But from introspection and reflection on the processes of thought and as of a model of thought and reasoning, that the Knackbaut is just a nice way of thinking about keeping things going and keeping things simple by always having the same sort of recourse to turning things over. So this other idea I thought to describe today is the spiral wave. So a wave is usually considered linear, as from the wave front, say, but the wave form or the wave crests and troughs, kind of as that being the simplest sort of wave front and wave form, with this backing another wave front and wave form, and furthermore wave front and wave form. That the waves are considered to be radial and also sort of spherical, is in the usual idea and with the most usual formula of the wave equation with regards to kx and t, or those being kind of the usual names for variables of a simple wave equation, with regards to the wave number and the placement or the offset and the time. And so the idea of a spiral wave then is that it's known that in many various systems of nature that the spiral form or spiroform arrives it's part of the structure of things. So the shell of a conch, or otherwise the spiral arms of a galaxy, or and many of these other ideas of exponential or natural growth have it so that's the way of things is something that as it proceeds apace as of about an origin, and its revolutions about the origin either goes out or goes in. And so that the spiral is sort of complement to the wave, whereas the wave is at once just kind of going out, and then it has all its things to do with like wavelets, and then also the wavelets, and the resonances of the constructive and destructive interference, as well the spiral does, but in an entirely different manner. The wave constantly increases as a maximum its distance from its origin, whereas the spiral constantly increases at a minimum its distance from the origin. So you can imagine waves on spirals and spirals on waves. And then the idea that a wave as having this origin and impulse, and here that's considered, well, how can anything change at all with regards to the unit impulse and the basis of impulse, and these kinds of ideas of the wavelets, say, as the cores or kernels of these things, then the spiral forms are often that much closer related to geometry as being linear themselves, curvilinear, whereas the waves are so at once oscillating and varying in their wavefronts that the spiral is sort of a least amount that in fact keeps it bending back in or curving back around in to itself. So the spiral wave is the other concept here is introduced. Then besides just nature as ubiquitous and spider webs and conch shells and these things of the spiral, Then there's also as to the waves, that the waves is pretty well defined and understand as like, well, that's a fungible model of change in an open system at all. So like as from moments in motion, or just usual accounts in all of science for all of things, that waves are just a usual medium for things. Then having the idea that the spiral is always part of it is less so. It's an entire extra sort of consideration to attach to what would otherwise be the parameterizations, the variables of these equations, to go to show that. Then that gets into the implicits, and for mathematics and algebra, what it means when the quantities kind of carry a separate state across the derivations otherwise, so that the original derivations and the ideas of what was the linear help to introduce that the spiral wave can also be sort of this kernel of the unlinear and the nonlinear, as with regards to whether that's going to be suitable for the most general sort of form that can possibly be for the mechanics of motion and continuum mechanics, wave motion, and insofar as that spiral wave motion or wave spiral motion. So that's the other concept I want to introduce after this about the Knackbaut was this spiral waves. Then which one of those would kind of be more relevant is that they're kind of relevant in terms of each other, one for the discrete and one for the continuous. So the usual idea of the discrete and continuous is that, well, we can mark discrete numbers on a continuous line, and those suffice to then define or to mark, to observe the magnitudes as with regards to comparison to reference magnitudes, and then to compute the areas and these sorts of things. So in that sense, the discrete and continuous are so concurrent together. But then this idea of the Knackbaut is that, well, the Knackbaut is just on or off, say, or yes and no, but opposites in polarization. It never quite is the center. The idea is that it's always about and around the center. Whereas the spiral wave is also kind of about and around the center, but or an origin. That with regards to the center and the origin, is this consideration, the Knackbaut of the spiral wave in the continuum mechanics, that this sort of heartbeat or the action of the systolic, that which pumps like a heart and pump or the muscles and structures in the feet and calves which pump the blood, have that these are the kinds of the ideas that were thought to be arrived at today. So with that said, then it's just going to be a bit of going through the stacks. There's a book here of stacks, a box here of books. That a box of books is quite traditionally the largest possible store of information, say. This box of books, so it's just something I'll go through and see what we might be able to find from it. As then I'll just relate everything to these latest ideas, because they relate to all these previous ideas. And it's just a matter of that, then, that it's very attached to a very thorough sort of, and one hopes diligent and one hopes accurate account of the reasoning apparatus overall, and the relevance to reference to relevance, and all these requirements and desiderata of a theory at all that can overall be a good theory, and even when things are bad for theories, that is still a good theory and not a bad theory. So these are the ideas here. I've been watching some YouTube, and what I've been reading or watching the academic discourses, usually as correlates to a lecture with a board and this kind of stuff. Interviews, like with David Bohm the other day, and is looking at David Bohm as kind of a voice of reason. But for example, the other day it was like Sir Roger Penrose and his his explanation is like, I'm kind of a lot more of a Bohemian now than I was then, and though I'll have to backtrack and walk back a little bit, some things I said, I didn't believe those as much as I believe what this is now, about like continuum mechanics and this kind of thing. So that's kind of rewarding, because it's like, hey, that's taking a stand that's not necessarily held by all, and sometimes it wasn't very popular for that matter, and so then with that being something that you still hold to now, and give the credence of all your reputation to, helps a lot, and I'm glad for you, because otherwise it would be bad for you, and these kinds of things. So that and this, and then and people's learnings and readings themselves in philosophy largely. That's kind of what I study, insofar as that vis-a-vis like product reviews or the ideas of segments of things. One thing though that I was studying was when as I went to look for spiral wave, is that the most outstanding research I found in that was in regards to electricity, because the vortex theory, from Descartes and Kelvin, and maybe a bit of Helmholtz, though he's kind of mowed over as not saying much about it, but the electricians of the 19th century have that after Maxwell's laws. It's like, well, these are static lines of force, and then you change them by changing their configuration. You run current through it, or you move magnets relatively. It's like, well, then when that happens, also those they have to grow and come from somewhere themselves again. And so the flux the other way is kind of what's being considered here, and things about the skin effect. The spiral wave, it makes for like, well, what's a vortex or what's a spiral wave, and this and that. A lot of the stuff is really going on in terms of this. Like for an antenna and the open dipole or closed dipole, which means like, well, how does this antenna work? It's like, well, we're going to make a gap between them, like a capacitor, and then by the natural width, it will just kind of radiate from the current we put into it, electromagnetic waves in the radio spectrum, and also the very, very low. I mean, it kind of is bouncing around both sides here. So, and then also with regards to things like, well, when it starts going around in a circle, and so it has reflection and refraction, and then it starts making the impedance, the reactance makes it's like, well, it's kind of like eddy current in a flow. The wash of it starts making its own kind of wall of water, say, within this current, in this model of current. Of course, with electricity reversed from liquids, usually the core effect and the skin effect, they just do have these things differently. And so that then the siphon and the drain would be like the exact opposite, like this spiral outside. Whereas, well, both are pointing to each other in terms of each other, the liquid and electrical models of fluids for circuits and systems of pipes. The spiral wave is going to come up now. It's like, well, we can't really add or remove anything from all these mathematics of the theories of physics. And so, well, how about if it just kind of comes around on the outside? And then as regards to that is like, and makes for a continuous medium again, and supports all these notions of turbulence and the wash flow and flux and all these kinds of things, because otherwise it's missing out some things, and there'll be otherwise also when talking about things like quantum mechanics or electricity or nuclear radiation, other things you can't really see. Although sometimes those effects can be strong enough that they will drive the optical nerves, and you can see these things in a sense. It's like, well, if that's really the effect of these things, then otherwise it wouldn't really be known what they are doing. And so then by trying to just figure that out, the whole spiral wave idea is going to come a long ways to have for that real things. And then here that's also related, it's an original analysis, because it's about like where it comes from and where it goes. It's this original analysis. And it does have to do with some of these other concepts introduced here, as far as I know. That this is another thing I found that made me sort of glad that I had discovered them. So there's this guy, Edward Witten or something like that. So he's a totally old school, frontline, famous researcher in quantum mechanics and nuclear theory. But the thing about the identity dimension and the semi-dimensions of what is he employs this thing with regards to like the half plane. So it's just things to do with the half plane where it's like, well, we're just going to set up an analytical basis about this origin, so we're going to kind of have a winding about it. And it relates as soon as you get into stuff like Wick rotation or the winding numbers and all these kinds of things, it puts itself up front, whether later it's just kind of recedes into the background. That's another thing I noticed the other day was that, hey, I would be able to find a ton of different things from the 60s and 70s that would help stand this up, and I might not really need all that either. To get stuff in the convolutional setting and these kinds of things. So looking at these books, what is this here? Okay, this is a multi-objective heuristic search, an introduction to intelligent search methods for multi-criteria optimization. So Dasgupta Chakrabarty and Descartes have this book. And when I read this before, it's largely about the placement and layout of circuits and circuit design. So the space planning problem. How do you, given that you have a bunch of traces on the left and a bunch of traces on the right, and they may or may not cross, and that they are to have the least amount of distance between them, and then that eventually they all have to be arranged so that they don't cross. That's an example of what's called synthesis of circuits, or the planar circuits. And so this book is largely with that as like its target of application. But what it gets into is a lot of the different ideas after like recursive descent and divide and conquer of what's possible to find a path finding or to search for something. That this multi-objective heuristic search brings together a lot of results in the field after recursive descent and these kinds of things, which have their well-known asymptotic runtimes and costs and resources with regards to trying to figure out how to help figure that out. So it kind of reminds of the space planning otherwise and combinatorial space enumeration, which is kind of a bottom-up approach vis-a-vis different ways from a top-down approach to say it's like, well, we're going to lay this trace first and then that trace and that trace, to say instead, well, in this region we'll have this crossing or this surrounds or this way about it. This multi-objective search is a pretty high-level research book. It would be considered industrial or with regards to the graduate level after mathematics courses. I haven't really seen anything else exactly quite like it, but I imagine that in the field you can find many, many papers. Kind of like if you're interested in natural language, and it's like, well, is there like a school of natural language and natural language understanding? It's like, well, yes and no, because there's this one great resource on the internet, though, and what they do is they collect that there's 8 or 10 major recurring conferences of natural language understanding. And so then they have kind of just collected all those together. And so with that is possible to find all these different proceedings and all these different papers. They're pretty good about natural language understanding. And so this is a kind of thing, and I forget if it's called papers or archive or something like that. It's something to research and find this central store of all these proceedings, all these conferences in NLU or natural language understanding. Because then what you can find is hundreds, if not thousands, of good and pretty well modern papers in natural language understanding, helping explain how it's so possible to get so easily up to something like the triples usually of inference of relations of these tuples or triples or RDF or OWL, knowledge interchange format, or all these usual ways that facts as they are kind of put on the file card way back in the billions and billions of them behind these large language models, say, where the search engines like Google and them being the front for all this stuff, then had this that's the knowledge base that they start with to then front all this other stuff, which is just how fast to go, information retrieve it or whatever. It's a lot easier to find something after it's already been found, say. That this kind of thing in the search is like, it hasn't already been found. Go find one, compared to, it's like, it's just somewhere back in the card catalog, don't forget that number, this kind of thing. But the natural language understanding was just kind of described as relevant to this, because in the multi-objective heuristic search, there's that's whole field of these things, and so it's kind of after combinatorial enumeration is kind of the underlying idea of that. It's like, well, what works? It's like, well, we're going to start a recursive descent. We're going to try making changes, and we're going to have a plan so that our changes won't just repeat themselves. We think it out so the changes don't repeat themselves, and then try and test each one until we find at least one. So that's the usual idea of finding a way, vis-a-vis finding the way, and these kinds of things. But then for the natural language understanding, it's much similar. There are many, many efforts, many of which are duplicative, which is not the same thing as duplicitous. Duplicative, that then this is a good usual idea of how to go about finding these things. So that's a good little book. Let's take a look at what this next book in the stacks might be. Before we were looking at isomorphisms of types, or Roberto de Cosmo's isomorphisms types, term graph rewriting. So it's like, how do you write a program? Well, we get some instructions and write some other instructions in a language we understand to another language we understand, or at least a language that has these definitions that will be relatable to these other definitions. So term graph rewriting is just that in a box. It's like, well, how do we do term graph rewriting? Well, we have a language of terms and graphs, and so the call graph of programs and terms according to definitions. And so in a programmatic setting, when it gets like, well, how do we rewrite all this code? It's like, well, first you kind of read it as code, and then you write it however you want. And because it's written one way, which has the usual idea of the principle of paucity, or who is that fellow from the IETF RFCs or whatever? He's got a law of sorts. Postel's law, I guess it is be conservative in what you admit and liberal in what you accept, say. And I tend to use different words in that because I don't want anything associated with this polemical, inappropriate appropriation of the traditional terms conservative and liberal as polemical and flaming, what would you call it, progressive radicals, and of the polemical variety. But anyways, to be conservative in what you emit means to relay terms that are not more than subject to proper interpretation by generous or simply limited reading. And then to be liberal in what you accept is say, hey, if this protocol has two variants, read both of them. Because otherwise, at some point in time, even though 99% of the time there's only going to be one protocol, at some point in time there will be the other. And then whether that's just something broken or whether it should be the way of things, gets into like when systems change and the versioning and schemas of specifications and all these kinds of things. If you've ever been in one of these usual typical corporate enterprise software environments, where everything is just zeros and ones, but there are a lot of them, and somehow it's got to be specifically, that 0 and 1 over there, these kinds of things. So then for this term graph rewriting, it's kind of the idea of this is how we can make a model of switches, so that if we can't actually go in and make the act of translation ourselves, it can still result in an act of translation can result. And so term graph rewriting in this theory and practice of widely professional computing, edited by Sleep, Plasmager, and von Eekelen, or the Dutch or Danes, we kind of call them sometimes, from 1993, that this is a great thing. Kennewick, Klopp, Sleep, and De Vries is in an introduction to term graph rewriting, partial type assignment, and left linear applicative term rewriting systems. So in a translation system that says, well, I will only have to use this many resources, given this sort of idea. This is what its possibilities may so be. How to get confluence for explicit substitutions, and starts discussing the lambda calculi and the lambda calculus, say the theory of types and relating things in types. The type theory is just so great, and it has a lot going on. And inverting the diamond, or completing the types, inverting the tree and inverting the diamond, is a really great kind of concept that most people arrive at once they've been in object-oriented programming with the theory of types for some time. One hopes. Term graph rewriting, a great little book from 1993 that is still in effect today. That it's indisputable that all this stuff that's like today is like, well, we can use generative programming. It's like, well, I got this book on term graph rewriting from 1993, and then this one with the generative programming was from 1967. So that's been around a long time already. Sensory evaluation techniques. This book from the Chemical Rubber Company Press is about the design of experiment. And then it says with regards to both figuring out what people's stimulus and responses things usually are, and then also with regards to the externals. An external preference map is more complicated to construct than an internal preference map. That's because the whole idea of this internal preference map is probably like, well, it's like that's what they'll buy. That's what makes Pavlov's dog salivate when you ring this bell. And the external one is like, well, Pavlov's dog evolved and now he won't respond unless we ring the bell, and also he won't stop growling at us because we kept kicking him or something like that. As an example, Pavlov's dog and operant conditioning and all that kind of stuff. That these sorts of experiments are kind of a bit odd sometimes. Fechner, F-E-C-H-N-E-R, Fechner, selected as his measure of the strength of sensation the just noticeable difference, the J-N-D. For example, he would regard a perceived sensation of 8 J-N-Ds as twice as strong one of 4 J-N-Ds. So these are like decibels. This is like on a scale of 1 to 10. How much is it? And then that's the usual idea of the powers of 2 then, and like a just notable difference would be 1, and then the powers of 2 go up through that, so it's 10 to the 2, or it's also happens to be which is 1024 2 to the 10, and that 10 to the 2 and 2 to the 10 are pretty close, and it's a numerical coincidence, but then also ends up being like, well, we're doing arithmetic that might just work on decimal and binary most specifically. So then with regards to scales and matters of scale and comparative and relative scales and absolute and relative scales, that this expresses kind of the differences that, these just notable differences are like half or double, or one more or one less. And then it's with regards to like until there's not any more left, or it's like the least, or until there's not any more left, or the most, or like infinitely many. That being the usual fifth side left open, the infinitely many. That this is just an example then of that, trying to describe numbers or colors or tags or characteristics of things is do these things. And then it gets into a usual course in the college, they'd call it statistics, and computing least squares, simple linear regression, principal component analysis, which is a great thing, They're getting into gradient descent and principal component analysis, or means of finding things, finding numbers. That's a great little book. Oh, this is probably then just kind of the computer box then. Computer Science and Engineering Handbook. See, now I've gone through all these books before here. And so, in this talk before, I've gone through stack. This would be in the science references probably, because this book is from 1990, and it's all sorts of considerations of what at the time was considered the Computer Science and Engineering Handbook. I got it from Half Price Books for $14.95. I got most of my books from Arundel Books in Seattle, but then I often go out to Half Price Books or what. I haven't ordered any books off of the internet, say, for 15 or 20 years at least. It's just something I don't order anything off of anything, but this is the kind of thing that is one of those things. One book I did find though the other day was Aristotle's Dictionary. So I imagine then this would be a good time to look back a few more years than like 10 or 15 years ago, when all this latest greatest stuff that's just being rewrapped as new was already sort of underway. And then they're like, well, how are we gonna deal with the disclosure of this technology to the public? It's like, well, let's monopolize it first, and not do it, and then worry about the rest of it later, until such time as when it was possible. It's like, yeah, though it's possible to get chatbot codes so much so that everybody's got chatbots already before we release, an AI offering or what it may so be. Let's try and keep them in this walled garden here, Google's search and search and hide interface. That these are the usual kinds of things. So Aristotle's Dictionary, though, edited by Thomas P. Kiernan, Kiernan. It's from the Modern Library. Who's this? The Philosophical Library. So the Philosophical Library is pretty cool because I think that's where the print of the Einsteins out of my later years is also from the Philosophical Library. So it's $7.50. At long last, a comprehensive tool in English for a better understanding of the most basic terms in Aristotle's philosophy. I got this at a bookstore up the road here a ways. I stop in there every some months, and then this is what I had found there since last time. Aristotle was born at Stagira in Thrace. Now, if I mispronounce a word, at least I'll usually just mispronounce it consistently. Then at some point in time, I might amend my pronunciation a bit. So if I don't know too much the difference between Stagira and Stygia or Stygia, whether it's a hard or soft G or long or short vowel or these kinds of things, or various transliterations, it should be pretty clear from the context. Though sometimes it's not really clear from the context who is who, or even something like that. Like Zeno. It's like, well, you mean the Zeno from the 100 years before or the Zeno from 100 years after? It's like, well, I'm not quite sure. It's like, well, how about like you mean the Judas Iscariot? It's like or the one of the other three Judases of the time of 0 to 75 A.D. or from like 150 B.C. to 200 A.D. who's involved in various things. It's like, well, aren't those different people? It's like, well, I don't know. I don't know. These kinds of things, Zeno, and is just an example of these long-lived people and involved in a lot of different things, and then just going by various appellations. Of course, that's not to be the same thing as comparing something like Peter of Abelard and Peter of Spain or something like that, when those were two different people or not, vis-a-vis long-lived people, and then people who show up in lots of different roles, like Forrest Gump, say, or something like that, a fictional account. In the year 384 BC. So these days, it often say BCE Common Era instead of BC before Christ, that being 0 AD. The calendar was adjusted to that, and at some point in time, there was the Gregorian calendar is after the Julian calendar. So at some point in time, in about 1300, it's like, well, the calendar's off by 22 days. It's accumulated. Yeah, well, make a new one. Vis-a-vis different chronologies, one great source that I can find of those in chronologies is like in the Java computer language's standard library for chronologies, is they have a good listing of all these different chronologies. And so that's a good example of something that would be kind of hard to find, or it's just not a usual subject or topic of consideration. Yet at one point in time, they put that all together so then they could support like the Tibetan and the Himalayans or the Mayans and these other chronologies, which are all based on the solar year, pretty much. These kinds of things. The profession of medicine had been in his family for many generations. At 17, Aristotle was sent to Athens, perhaps because he was brought up in an atmosphere that was closely related to medicine and the theories of the healing art. Such a background can explain his gift to later be manifested across broad areas of knowledge for the concrete and positive for experiment and analysis. Then he joined Plato's Academy. For 20 years he was in the Plato's Academy till Plato died. While at the Academy, Aristotle found in Plato, a friend and teacher for whom he had the greatest reverence. And although Aristotle's eventual teachings were to be a large degree grounded on disagreements with Platonic theory, he's a devoted student. After Plato's death, he went with Xenocrates. So Aristotle left the academy with Xenocrates. You mean Zeno? Xenocrates? Well, it's kind of the same. And journeyed to Essos, where under the sponsorship of Hermias, ruler of Atarnias, he established a Platonic community in which he put forth the beginnings of his own autonomous teaching. So these are familiar names and also close to other familiar names. 3 years later, after having married Pythias, the daughter of Hermias, he went to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, where he met Theophrastus, who was to become his most ardent and celebrated disciple. So it's good to see that Xenocrates is so closely associated with Aristotle in this passage, because Xenocrates is for this other Aristotle's continuum. So the continuous domain that's usually given in all the linear account is the complete ordered field. It's like, well, what are the real numbers? It's like, well, you know the rational numbers first and how they fill in and they're dense and all the normal natural numbers. Well, imagine this closing the gaps in those. So it's all those. And then there's no gaps and there's no leaps and they're perfect somehow. They're real numbers. Well, this other idea of the line reals is like, well, do you know what real numbers are? It's like, well, what is it? And you know what a magnitude is, a number, right? It's just like between 0 and 1 or what? It's a number. It's like, so all those are real numbers. So what are the real numbers? It's like, well, you put a pencil down at 0 and draw it to 1, and all those magnitudes, as you could possibly figure out from that, are magnitudes and they're real numbers. So line reals here. So it's from Xenocrates say that I've read somewhere that when Aristotle says, hey, well, he describes line reals so simply, and then it's later picked out that, yeah, we're just going to have eudoxus and field reals, and it's Archimedean too, and it's easy to build right after the Pythagorean. That then, thusly, how one might say, Xenocrates is, when I say Aristotle's continuum, I might amend that to just later say Xenocrates' continuum, just to help take some of the burden off Aristotle from all these people have putting all this one-sided half accounts on him. Whereas then to say that he was quite more thorough than usually given credit for, Aristotle. And so then Xenocrates can also just kind of be noted for that. And then is whether that's related to Zeno and Xenon. It's like, well, it's not too different, although they were of various at the time and place and these kinds of things. So, Macedonia, and then he went to, he became the tutor of Alexander the Great. Aristotle left Macedonia for Athens by way of Stagira, his birthplace, which had been rebuilt by Alexander in compensation for Aristotle's pedagogical services. Returning to Athena in Athens in 335 and 4, Aristotle founded his own school, the Lyceum. So the Athenaeum and the Lyceum are traditionally these great halls and schools. In 323, following the death of Alexander, there was in Greece a great reaction against the Macedonian suzerainty, and Aristotle found himself in peril because of his association with Alexander, because the Lyceum was established under Macedonian protection. Therefore fled to Chalcis, the birthplace of his mother, who lived for a year before his death. So Aristotle's life in a nutshell. And it's Aristotle has this nephew who is responsible for a lot of the stuff surviving. And it went back into Persia and the center of the Turkish and the Ottoman later, quite a while later, but later, and then all that kind of stuff. So one reason Aristotle's still around is because then it was communicated quite widely, all the stuff that Aristotle was able to collect and to categorize and put out. That there's much original work in Aristotle, of course, but of course then it's just some of its influences, and that those influences may have been in accordance with documents is well known, that though it's hard to find those that survive in these times from thousands and thousands of years ago, that they just had their own ones too. So this is where kind of then it comes together that Aristotle is given all this stuff. He's held up as an individual and not really just like a panel of a person, because it was able to kind of be it's so relayed that he did write all these things and put them all together himself. Then as with regards to all these different influences and go into it, it's kind of like from reading the medieval philosophers and their histories, that so much more is available about the surrounds of what goes into it, the Knackbaut overall. That it's cool though that with this account everybody has the same picture of what his life was, and helping to explain and relating to the people in their own lives what those events may have been. The circumstances surrounding Aristotle's writings are lodged in a curious paradox. The writings which he designated for general publication, the esoteric works, which were well known in antiquity, are now for the most part lost and unknown, whereas those which were written for presentation to his students and colleagues, the pedagogical, those meant for instruction and didactic instruction, and rote instruction usually, and which are relatively obscure in antiquity, are those which have survived. These latter works are, of course, extremely complicated and axiomatic in style, due to the fact they were intended for limited and highly specialized scholarly consumption. On the other hand, those works written for public consumption were of a much more graceful literary style, fluidly oratorical and discursive, and in quite stark contrast to the prosaic severity of his scholastic writings. There remain of his public works only fragments, most numerous of which belong to the dialogues Protrepticus and Eudemus. These fragments come out of his earliest writing period, when he was still under the direct influence of Plato. It is evident that in this earliest period it is generally agreed that his work falls in the three main periods he held without much reservation to the Platonic philosophy. In his second period, Aristotle began to separate himself from Platonic theory, becoming less the poetic philosophizer and more the empirical scientist. He criticized Plato's theory of forms or ideas, and took profound issue with the formerly held distinction between matter and form, negating the contention that these two terms constituted dualism. He maintained, on the other hand, that matter and form are indissolubly united to form what is truly real being. So today that would still be called, that's considered Platonist, because that's given it a reality of itself. And so this second period, people might read that and say, oh, I just read from this introduction to this book that in my philosophical maturity, that Aristotle became a less of a Platonist. And so in my logicist positivism, I can say I'm being Aristotelian to so follow that. Let's see what the author says about this third part. Aristotle's third period was that of his engagement in the Lyceum, where his genius for the organization of a detailed research in the realms of nature and history awesomely manifested itself. The method and spirit of intensely incisive research in the phenomena of nature and history, which Aristotle fathered, represented something completely new in the Greek culture, and of course it still has its ramifications in the contemporary world. And yet there is no evidence from which to conclude that Aristotle, the growing empiricist, ever abandoned the more poetical flight through metaphysical speculation. So in this case, he's really growing out the theory and the axiomatics and this kind of thing, the empiricist. And today we have even more data, and we know that science describes nature, which is super classical. And so like the spiral waves and how that can be when it's like, well, there's not much room left over because our fields already fill that entire circuit. You know, it's like it'd have to going around again, and these kinds of things helps. But the data for sure is there. That this is just then another example though that people might look at that and say like, well, what was Aristotle's great thing where he got to? Is like, well, he became just more than ever the greater empiricist. And it's like, well, it was kind of abbreviated, bud, because at some point in time, you know, if this was 322 to 384, so that's 62 years. That's a pretty long time. But in people's philosophical mental maturity, they might or might not ever reach these stages at all. But then over time, it does get back to there being at least one metaphysical ideal and true truth and these kinds of things, so that we can kind of reduce the Platonism to that a little bit compared to like the mysticism and the occult, or some of the things to do otherwise with his theories and his philosophies and his psychology. Again, though, we can read this Aristotle at least was a thoroughly great pragmatic empiricist, and in the Lyceum was raised a lot of these issues in the science of the day, if not so much the philosophy about this development, the sort of the development itself, the search for these things. It's easier to search for ideals when you already have them. It's kind of a thing. The Aristotelian system, or Aristotelianism, is not a radical contradiction of Platonism, as has often been told. No, it is not. Rather, it is, if not a continuance of Plato's theories, at least an extension of Platonic thought. So this goes to show that, where he was exploring all this stronger logicist positive and this kind of stuff, it's as well so that it was among all these, the metaphysics and the idealism in this. So he grew a lot in the pragmatist empiricism. Historically speaking, Aristotelianism is the development of Platonism, though through critical examination based on empirical evidence and physical fact, into a new metaphysics constructed on synthesis, or the dialectics, say. Plato's metaphysics was a subjective, one-sided flower of the imagination. Aristotle's was a comprehensive and intricately landscaped garden of empirically supported logic. That's by, and then the initials of the editor here, Kiernan. Introduction. Aristotle is attributed 3 historical periods. So here the primary resource for Aristotle is this McKeon's Aristotle. So now I got this McKeon's Aristotle and this Kiernan's Aristotle. But as a dictionary of terms, let's try and find some of the usual terms we use here and see what it says they say. Division of the sciences, the organon, forms of speech, Hermias, the title of the second treatise in the organon. Variously translated, though most references to the work employ the Latin de interpretatione. So hermeneutics and the hermeticism and stuff like that is it's about both. So it is kind of like this idea of the Knackbaut or whatever, and it's like, well, what did he say? How can we translate what he says? It's like, well, that's a good question. There are questions about communication. And so then when it's regards to things to become more rapid, it's like, we've established the various questions are already answered. And so then when something's said, then it's done. Then this idea of the turning things over and then the spiral wave or wave spiral, that's a different kind of thing. So we consider that we are dealing here with a judgment as manifested by a proposition, which is composed of a noun and verb at least, which is either an affirmation or a denial, which is either true or false. So that's the usual idea of a judgment as with regards to carrying a conviction or tentatively an understanding. I tend not to use the word understanding because it's associated with lack thereof. And then that there's these kinds of things to figure out. Aristotle is clear in the very first chapter that he is mainly concerned with the mental activities, not just oral or written signs. So another book that I've been reading over time here is Descartes and the Meditations. It's what Descartes and the Meditations gets into is the ideas of, at some point in time in the middle, he does say cogito ergo sum or cogito ergo sum. So the whole idea of I think therefore I am, that being the great word that comes down from Descartes, is just sitting there right in the middle of this book. It's kind of like when you're watching a movie or reading a book, and at some point in time you come across the title of this book. And whether it's like the central concept of it all throughout and it can never be found, or it like Wilkes War and Remembrance or War and Peace, what's it about? Oh, it's about that. Vis-a-vis something that's just like a title, like The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It's like, well, that's tossed around a bunch of times in that book. And then there's something that's like, well, where's cogito ergo sum? Where does he say it? It's like he says it once, in just kind of in passing, in the middle of this book. So it's kind of like Kant's Sublime. If you weren't looking for it, it'd be pretty easy to miss it. But as part of the development, it's just right in the middle. Whether philosophy is like, in the beginning we're going to lay out our terms, and it's going to be defined, and then we're going to deliberate upon them. Or it's like a philosophy, we're going to make terms, we're going to turn them over, we're going to contemplate them, at the end we'll have a term. Or whether it's kind of both, and in the middle, Descartes' philosophy helps go to show that then this idea of this translation, the mental activities, is Descartes spends a lot of time on his mental activities to arrive at these things. And absent that, it wouldn't have enough context to establish that. So that's kind of what that's about. Descartes is being influenced by these very things as well, besides kind of synthesizing them together and also having that he presents considerable amounts relating to notions of the omni, the supreme, and the higher, and this kind of stuff. Propositions, formal opposition, this treatise, the subject matter of the investigation, the prior analytics. So yeah, the prior and the posterior analytics get into like all these premises, and that would be logic to most people. Examples, every kind of demonstration. Objection or instantia in stasis is a premise contrary to a premise and may be partial or total in its opposition to the original syllogistic proposition major minor. So instantia is saying, well, what if, hypotheticals or what if not particularly. Objection. So abduction. Abduction is a technical term that classifies an argumentative procedure, perhaps midway between demonstration and the dialectical syllogism. In it, the first term is known to be with the middle, but it is not evident that the middle is with the last. So this gets into like Hegel's, later Hegel has this great organization of these kinds of considerations. So about Hegel and the Wissenschaft der Logik, or Wissenschaft der Logik. And so this is something that is related to these same Aristotelian terms, say. In it, the first term is known to be with the middle, but it is not evident that the middle is with the last, so it is more credible than the conclusion. Or again, if the means of establishing the minor are less than the media for the conclusion, we have an abduction, or epagogy, in contrast with induction, which is an epagogy. So this is good for my understanding, because I will have to reference these terms forever after now for the inductive inference and the deductive inference. And here, for example, this case for abduction, and the way I've been framing it is that's deduction again. And so it's the course is saying, well, by deduction it could be any of these three ways. And so it doesn't you can't always say it's like, well, it's this way and not this other way, because then it wouldn't have this way and then this is not this other way. It's inversion, and this principle of inversion instead of non-contradiction is the only way to kind of find these things, because it's not just a long path to go find these things. It's many paths to find these things. So this is a good example, though, of introduction of these terms. So then I'll be able to look at apagogy or epagogy to find out where it's going to say that this is related to, in a more Latin terms, the inductive and deductive accounts and the abductive accounts. These are the kinds of things. All right, so let's see what else we have here then. And enthymemes. Enthymeme is a great thing with the anaphora and cataphora and these kinds of things. What I'd like to do is look for the epagogy and the pedagogy, and the apagogy of the pedagogy of the apagogy and epagogy. Being property of, being as a copula, being and non-being, being in truth. Let's see if it has the Greek in here as well. Differences, didactic, diversity, dramatic ability. So these are English terms. And then this is an English dictionary of Aristotle's terms. But what I'd be interested in then is induction and deduction, disputation, disposition, diversity, division, doctrine, dialectic, didactic. Didactic arguments are those which syllogize from the proper principles of each discipline and not from the opinions of him who answers. So that's just matters of definition and avoiding misunderstandings. Deduction. Demagogue. So demagogy or whatever, where the power is not vested in the laws, their demagogues abounded. So this is people with their voice and vis-a-vis like the inductive voice, the deductive voice, the abductive voice, the instructive voice, and these being just like street people's voices. The idea of the demagogues are like the soapboxers and the Usually, what you'd call is uh, just loud voices say. The one flatter the few when they are in power. The others are those demagogues who have a share in the oligarchy and flatter the people. So that's generally a negative sort of connotation. Whereas with regards to the role, it's like the mealy mouth of the sort, or the how one might say, uh, the windbag of the variety. Democracy. Now, so democracy, as you can imagine, has a quite longer entry. When the husbandmen and those only who possess moderate fortunes have the supreme power, they will govern according to law. For as they must get their livings by labor, they have but little leisure for public business. They will therefore establish fit laws, called public assemblies, when there is a necessity, and they will readily let everyone partake with them in the administration of public affairs, as soon as they possess that fortune which the law requires as a qualification. For to exclude any class would be a step towards oligarchy, and for all to have leisure to tend unless they have a subsistence would be impossible. This form of government, then, is one species of democracy. Another species is distinguished by the prevailing mode of electing magistrates, which everyone is eligible to, whose birth there are no objections, provided he is able to find leisure to attend. For this reason, in such a democracy, the supreme power is vested in the laws, as pay is not given. A third species is where all freemen have a right to a share in the government, but where they will not accept it for the cause already signed, for which reason here also the supreme power will be in the law. A fourth species of democracy is the last established in point of time in the states. For the states, cities have always been large, far beyond their original size, and the public revenue has been considerably populous on account of their numbers, are admitted to share in the management of public affairs. Neither the poor are at leisure to attend to them, as they receive pay. Nay, they have the greatest leisure of all, as they are not hindered by having any care of their own property, as is the case with the rich, who on this account often take no part in the public assembly and the courts of justice. Thus the supreme power is lodged in the poor, and not the laws. So, democracy here, according to Aristotle, is rule of law. We have one here, theoretically, and it's widely held up to be for what we have minority rights, and so thusly individual rights enshrined in the very law of the law, or the first reading of the law, the founder's intent, the framer's intent, and all these things. Constitutionality, it is the law. And so we are all the law, is what this says. So I haven't gotten much further, and the hour is upon us. But what I wanted to look at was some more in this Aristotle's Dictionary. So what I got here is kind of like Aristotle's Dictionary, and then Boyer's History of Mathematics. So between those, kind of front and back, it's pretty thorough an account of for foundations. Foundations. Good day, gentle readers, fellow earthlings.